All right, we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for bearing with us. We are super excited for today's Sanders Series invited lecture from Bill Buxton. I'm actually going to invite Gord Kurtenbach to come up and give him an introduction. I just want to quickly say, as Gord will probably mention, Bill's influence on the field of human-computer interaction goes very deep. Probably not just because of his own contributions, but on the people he's impacted and influenced. And I myself was an undergraduate, and I know there's a lot of students here who just happened to fall upon an undergraduate research project working with not only Bill Buxton, but many of his colleagues. And even today, working at Autodesk Research, I work with a lot of the people who Bill Buxton directly worked with and directly influenced. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to be welcoming Bill Buxton here. So let me call up Gord Kurtenbach to give him a proper introduction. Thanks.
Thanks, Ubi. So I'm really thrilled to see a big crowd here, and I'm sort of assuming that pretty much everybody in here is interested in human-computer interaction. Otherwise, it'd be sort of odd that you were here. And so I'm thrilled to invite my supervisor, PhD supervisor, Bill Buxton, to give this talk. And I was thinking about the remarks that I was going to make, and I thought, you know, especially to this crowd, to the average person on the street, when they think of, you know, user interfaces, and they really think about, well, I guess it's making stuff easier to use. And in layman's terms, some of that, you know, translates into things that are, you know, visually nice, or maybe that you can get the task done. And what Bill has done in his career, I think, is really phenomenal. He's sort of pushed well beyond those concepts, and to really show that the scholarship and the study of UX design and design itself is really both an art form and a science. And I think he's done a tremendous amount of work in that area. And I think really at the center of Bill's work is sort of the larger context of UX design. It sort of begins with interaction on the screen or interaction with the device, but it's really the overall context of how those things, those products, those user interfaces get used within the context of our environment and within the context of our human experience and within the context of our culture. And we're all seeing that play out today. And so I think his research over the years plays a massive role of understanding sort of where we're going in the future and what choices we can make about the future that we're going to create for ourselves. So, you know, ultimately I think that you'll see in this talk, if you've ever wondered why, you know, maybe some of you have some old cell phone that you just really loved, or there was some application years ago that had some particular properties that made it wonderful and a lovable and effective thing, just like people love an old violin or some particular artifact. I think Bill's work, his lifetime of work, which has involved, you know, massive research publications, column for Business Week, and his book, Sketching User Experiences, have all sort of addressed that, of how we do understand this larger context of design. So I'm really thrilled to welcome Dr. Bill Buxton. Hey, Bill.
So first, thank you for that. I'm not sure who you were talking about, but so let me say, first of all, none of this comes out of nothing, and I think it's really important. This is the old story about standing on the shoulders of giants, and we all have a role to play. And I guess Margaret Mead said that never doubt that a small group of determined individuals could change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. And in that regard, I'd say that when I came here in 1975 to Toronto as an artist in residence at the DGP lab across the street, even before it burned down the first time. It hasn't burned down a second time. But it was like Ron Becker and Les Mezzi who brought me here, convinced me to come. They invented a thing called artist in residence. There wasn't such a thing. And so you basically, when you get treated that well, you basically have this obligation to pass it on. And you can actually see now it's gone from them to me, to people who worked with me, and there's actually great-grandchildren or I think there's actually great-grandchildren of Beckers now that are just doing spectacular work. And so I'd love to take credit, but all I can do say is that I was really lucky on whose shoulders I jumped on. and it's not just luck, it's determination and actually having a belief system. And that ultimately, it's a cultural and a social thing. And that brings us to the talk. And first of all, there's probably a new word there for some of you, Ubiety, and the notion of mismanners and so on and so forth may seem a little bit strange. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And so yes, I think this is sort of the Emily Post version of ubiquitous computing and artificial intelligence and design and where we're going in technology. So, and it's interesting if you look on that right off the bat, in this original book of Emily Post, the blue book, that's interesting, but it's about social usage. The notion that it's about social science, social, and conjures that up, it brings me to sort of what drives some of what I'm going to talk about today, and so I have to come back to a couple local references, but one would say Barry Wellman, who's the one who sort of introduced me to the notion of social networks before social networks, before it meant Facebook, it actually meant something far deeper, and because that drives a huge amount of what I'm going to talk about today. And the other was Gail Moore, who was the first, one of the first people I hired on the telepresence project, and she was a sociologist as well. And she took me to task once when I was sort of talking about how do we deal with privacy and stuff like that. And she said, well, Bill, the thing is you don't understand is that you've got to understand there's 3 different strategies you can use. As a technologist, you're going to think always I can solve these things technologically. She said, but you also can use social mores. And there's social controls, but there's also legal controls. And so you have to, first of all, determine what is the right strategy or what combination instead of just assuming that you should do it in the technology or you should do it here and there. And that every one of those is a design decision and you have to figure out how the language to do that. And the third one is a friend of mine named Richard Harper, who I've worked with. He's an English sociologist. And he introduced me this notion about the moral order. And the moral order is sort of like, what are the social mores for a particular place? So you would violate the moral order if Tovi jumped up on the stage and here. But there's a range of things. And so the ultimate thing I want to get to is everything we know about sociology and the notion about social relationships. We, in HCI and UX, we started off sort of just being engineers who tried to get it right. Then psychology sort of, during the Second World War, started human factors and sort of applied psychology, and then that sort of the psychology came originally in the motor sensory thing. Then it started to bring in the cognitive side, so we get into cognitive modeling and that kind of work in HCI. But then we actually went further, and so we predicted this, and it actually happened, where you basically had, just like there was applied psychology as an applied version of the academic psychology, the same thing about applied sociology. So you can take social network theory and so on, and use that as part of the design discipline. But it always was using a sociology with respect to the humans, the society of people. And one of the theses I want to make today is this notion that all of that language and all of that theory can apply equally to the technologies themselves. That in some sense, the most underrepresented, most aligned, neglected society around us is a society of technologies. And then if we can start to mash up the society of technologies using the language of sociology with the society of people, you might actually get somewhere to improve where we are right now and dig ourselves out of the hole that I perceive as being in. So there's 2 notions of technology. So one of the things that actually was interesting was this guy, Mark Weiser, who many or most of you know of, who was a close colleague and friend who died really prematurely, but not before writing this classic paper, The Computer for the 21st Century in Scientific American, and used the term ubiquitous computing, and also defined what that actually meant. And I want you to notice that the definition of ubiquity is the condition of being everywhere in all places at the same time in general use. And so you will often hear, including at Microsoft or other places, that the thing we have to do today with ubiquitous computing and the Internet of Things and all these different things is that everything's everywhere all the time, and you have access to everything everywhere all the time, and all this is wonderful and hunky-dory. And I'd say absolutely not. And in fact, Mark, I think, used the wrong word. I have to say also that at the time Mark started to use the word ubiquitous computing, every one of us at Park had to look, well, not everyone, because not everybody's as stupid as me, but everyone like me had to look up the word ubiquitous. It was not in general use in the vocabulary. By the way, the same is true in 1973 or 4, and ask Ron, he'll be able to tell you this, prior to David Canfield Smith's PhD thesis, that the word the word icon, if you had asked anybody what that meant, it was a piece of Orthodox Greek or Russian art. It had nothing to do with these little pictographs that we use in our interfaces. That was a new term. So it came completely unburdened. Well, I want to introduce another one, which I think is far closer to what Mark actually meant and helps us go in the direction of where we're going right now in terms of manners, and that's Ubiety. Now, Ubiety is a close cousin to ubiquity. It is a real word. Many of you, has anybody ever heard that word before other than for me? By the way, I cannot tell you how I know about that word. I think I was flipping in the dictionary looking for ubiquity, and I found it by accident. And no, it's a true statement. It's because I was trying to talk about ubiquitous computing and trying to find out what the real definition was. I do that. I keep a, but the key thing about it is it has to do with location. That whole notion of place, location. And the main thing, if you take nothing out of this, two things. Put this in your vocabulary, and then learn how to explain it. And the exercise to do within the design and with your practice is say, place in what dimension? And if you take the most general sense, so Paul Durish and Sarah Bly have done this thing on place and space. There's a whole thing around this. But if you just sort of say, do I mean place and location and time? In geography, in GPS coordinates, in terms of relative place with Yas and me, which changes the social. So that's social place as well as relative place, and or some combination thereof. And so one of the first acts in terms of trying to design and overcome the world we're in right now is, what are the definitions of place, and what do the differences in place, what are the options, and how do they stack up and mash up in terms of and design decisions? Yeah.
So the root is the same, right?
Yes.
But UB means everywhere, right?
Yes.
So what's the difference between the next
So UB, I would say it this way. Everything everywhere, everything in its right place would maybe be the closest. I'm not a Latin scholar. You're the linguist of the crowd. You tell me. So, but I'll use a metaphor to try and talk a little bit about where we are and what the problems are. So there's a Canadian designer named Albert Schum, who's the head of design. He's the corporate VP for Microsoft for all of Windows. And he uses this metaphor of, everything I'm saying in the next two slides are basically riffing off of something he said to me. We're really good at building houses. Since the iPhone, let's say this is for houses what the iPhone was for mobile. And it has this flow and it's all this sort of stuff. It's really neat. You may not like the style, but whatever style you like, there's somebody who knows really how to build a beautiful log cabin or whatever type of greenhouse or whatever you want. So, and our discipline has been focused on building houses. And I like the metaphor of houses because the whole thing about when you design a house, you're not designing a physical object, you're designing an opportunity for a certain ease of life to facilitate amplifying the things that you value in terms of your lifestyle and how you live, how you eat, and how you entertain or how you work. And here's the problem, is that we, in getting good at simplifying and building houses, we've solved one set of problems in terms of reducing complexity, but we've pushed the complexity, we haven't gotten rid of it, we've just pushed it upstairs to a higher level of problem. And it hasn't disappeared. And in fact, the better we get at making cheap, affordable, wonderful houses, the worse the problem of escalating complexity is. And so then you get into this, which is, if you can't see it, neither can anybody living in Delhi right now. United can't even land in Delhi. But the point is that this one actually isn't Delhi, but it's another city in India. But the point is, the focus, it doesn't mean we stop doing the houses or the objects or the gadgets, but the problems that exist now are ones of urban design, city design, ecological design, because what's the point of having a great house if you can't see it? Because of all of the problems of the ecosystem in which it functions. And so, yeah, we can do these things which are pretty and gorgeous and slick and iPhone-ish, like the Nest, but but it doesn't matter. In fact, it makes the problem worse. And this is the paradox. The better we get at making incredibly wonderful apps, beautiful, desirable, affordable, useful services, and gorgeous, caressable devices, the worse the problem is. Because that causes an exponential growth in the number of applications, devices, and services that exist, and that leads to a real serious issue. And the issue is this. Ultimately, the thing that hits this is this thing I call the complexity barrier. And so here's what we've done at the point of the individual device. We've gotten really good at decreasing the complexity and by the way, inversely increasing the value and the appeal and affordability. And so they're cheap, great. They're valuable, great. They're lovely to use, great. And the complexity's gone way down. But what we forget is the combinatorics, given the threshold of frustration, the limits of human ability to deal comfortably with complexity, is the cumulative collection of all of these wonderful, affordable, desirable, useful things goes way above threshold. And so I'm great with the tree, but the forest is going to kill me. And that is exactly, in one incredibly scientific visualization example, I am a professor after all, what's happening, that's the one of three levels of abstraction in a cartoon form of what's happening in urban design versus architectural design. And so I'll give you an example to try and tie this in, keeping the urban design metaphor. And I'm going to talk about Eburbia and the road net of things. And by the way, I love that because it's called the rot that's eating away our society. So Eburbia is this network here, the road net, in fact. And the road net actually connects all of these devices here. They're called houses. And you notice there's routers that connect the bridges that bridge onto the network. They're called driveways. And you notice there's beautiful fenced garden walls to protect back, so everybody has a backyard that's private. And it is, in fact, a packet switching network. Those are the packets. They're called cars. Oops. And in those packets are the tokens, which are the people. And to be very clear that none of these people know each other. None of them have keys to each other's doors. They don't know the names of their neighbors. It doesn't matter how great the houses is. Nobody voluntarily wants to live there. And it's more of a necessity, and you make the best out of it. And the only reason you'd go there is because there's places that are even worse. See, there's at least no air pollution. You can see it through an aerial photograph. But the point here is that and it comes down to this, and there are a couple things. Just because things are connected, as they are there, everything's connected on the network. But that doesn't mean that there's any communication amongst them. There's no cooperation guaranteed. There's no collaboration. There's no community. There's no culture. And if you don't have any of those things or the ability to negotiate even or establish these things in a reasonable way, you end up with Eburbia, which is not a place that I think any of us would want to do from a human perspective. Now, this brings us to the so-called Internet of Things. And the first thing I'd say about that is that, for pity's sakes, if we're in the business designing these things and talking about them in an intelligent way, we have to stop taking marketing terms as if they were meaningful. And every time you hear Internet of Things, you should just scream out, "Oh, really? That's really interesting. Tell me about this new Internet of Things that's coming out right now." Now, of course, if you're going to do so, the prerequisite is you tell me about the Internet of unthings that must have preceded it. And then you say, well, but what do you mean? How can there be an Internet of Things? It's precisely my point. There has never been anything but an Internet of Things. And therefore, and by the way, none of the things which are computationally sophisticated, of which we have, let's say 1970s, or actually from the 60s, so we have 50 years of experience, they still can't talk to each other in any normal way. Notions like kinship, introduction, approach, graceful approach, departure. None of these things that in sociology we take for granted as not even undergraduate level sociology, after 50 years, are not in our computer systems in any way that you can have any sense of trust or even, and limit. And that is a problem. Because what people mean with the Internet of Things is that we're going to hack on more, cheaper, less computationally competent, less secure, harder to control things at an exponential rate onto the Internet without any clear improvement in the underlying architecture or in terms of the social relationships that actually let these things actually start to do things like communicate, much less support culture. And how do you negotiate those relationships? And so what we end up doing is we are like Charlie Chaplin here in modern times. We're just creating a complexity that is going to destroy us. My view is if we do not solve what I'm talking about within the next 5 to 7 years, there will be a crash in our industry which makes what happened in 2000 or any of the other .com, the bubbles bursts, look like child's place. We are on a rapid, and the better we get at doing the individual devices, the next killer gadget, the next killer application, next killer service, the faster it's going to hit the wall. And one of the things to work around that without being dramatically or over-dramatic is to say, recognize a few things. And this goes back to one of the earliest things that ever came out of. This is an example where somebody can come in and tell you something, criticize your work, and have a really profound effect. I remember early on working in DGP, and I was doing something, and somebody, Maureen Stone, came from Xerox PARC, visited the lab, and she says, you know, your stuff's really interesting, but it's just a hodgepodge. You're doing a whole bunch of things. There's no theme, there's no common theory behind it, and none of it makes any sense, except they're neat, but so what? And at first I started saying, well, of course there is. And then I sort of caught myself and said, well, actually, mea culpa. I'd never even thought about it in those terms. I was just working. I had good guidance, I had good people around me, but I didn't understand that. And so I wrote a paper called Chunking and Phrasing and in the Design of Human-Computer Dialogues or something like that. But that paper, my closest colleague now, a guy named Ken Hinckley, still says that's the best paper I ever wrote. And there's nothing I do which does not build upon that view, which was forced upon by being humiliated by my friend Maureen Stone. Not humiliated in a bad way. She gave me a really good challenge, and there's nothing you can do better to help somebody than give them a really solid question. And if you ever get a solid question, don't get angry. Just say, wow, they're really smart, you're really smart, there must be something interesting if there's a disagreement. And figure out what it is, because we're in a position where we can figure that out. But everything's a compound task. And my sense is that the prime measure, a prime measure of complexity is the degree to which we perceive things as being compound tasks. It's like this. It's what I call app hopping. You start off as a happy little frog on that lily pad. To get anything done, because there's a compound task, I have to jump from app to app, device to device. By the time I go through a sequence of these things, I'm pissed. And if you want to understand what I mean about this, how do you actually converge these things, is that I'm going down in a couple weeks to Jim Foley. If you ever took Foley and Van Damme as a textbook of computer graphics, he's retiring. And so I think about the first time I met him, and he'd written a paper that Ron had introduced me to, and it was Foley, Wallace, and Chan. And it was a paper about they were trying to come up with device-independent graphics for the input side, and so they had these atomic-level tasks. And one was put in a scalar value, and another one was put in a position, and another was ink, and go on, and one was text. And I just went up to Jim, and I didn't know my butt for a hole in the ground. And it was just like, I went up, and it was a graphics interface when it was in, I think, Toronto. And I said, you know, Professor Foley, you know, my name's Bill Buxton, and I think you made a mistake. And he looked at me, you pipsqueak, what the hell? But he didn't do that. He said, wow, what was it? And I said, well, you understand a position is just two scalars. And if you do it with a mouse, you perceive it as a single thing. So at the device level, two scalars can be done by one gesture, when in fact, if I have to type it in on a keyboard, I have to type them in plus the verb, and I have to remember the syntax. So that's a weight of about 5 to 1, 5 times more complex. Now, it won't be as precise, but I'm just saying that if you use the motor action to actually chunk things together, you can greatly simplify. And that works up the entire hierarchy of tasks from, as I will show you, from whether you're typing a number or pointing at something on a screen versus I'm going grocery shopping. And we'll go through that. But the main thing right now is that these things are really hard, and here's the challenge, is that the dirty little secret of highly accomplished people is what they've had to neglect in order to become highly accomplished. And the dangerous people are the ones who believe that their genius in this one area goes the full 360 because you're so blinded by their genius and what they're good at, they can't see what's in the shadows, like the proverbial deer in the headlights. But the fact is that you have to wrap things around to make sure that you have all these bases covered so you don't have absurdities like this. It's just paving over the problem instead, or painting over. And so this comes back to sort of the main messages, is that this guy's safe now because he's no longer allowed to be hunted and brought back to the States. But everybody's off searching for the next big thing. And I just want to point out, if you believe what I'm saying, if it's even plausible, say the next big thing is not a thing. Rather, it's a change in the relationships amongst the things that are already exist and will exist, and also amongst the people who live in the same ecosystem as those things. And there's not Photoshop. It's not. And I wish. And how these things meet. And so I have 3 rules that I would challenge you to set yourself. So by the way, there is no point in setting really low standards. I want to set the bar really high and then to provide the catalyst for somebody to invent the Fosbury flop. But do you know who Fosbury is? Dick Fosbury, leading up to the Mexico Olympics, I think it was 1966, the rules were your hips have to go over the bar first. And so you had to run this way and jump this way. That's how everybody learned to high jump. Fosbury realized that if he came and did a twist and shoved his butt out, his hips would still go first, but he could go over this way. And he just clobbered everybody. Now the point was, he did it within the rules, it was humanly possible, and he was no better of an athlete than anybody else. He just didn't train and follow the sheep doing it the same old way. And for every hurdle, like this one I'm setting you, I'm saying, I don't know what the Fosbury flop is for what I'm talking about. I have some ideas. But collectively, amongst this room, we all have the potential to actually help to invent the Fosbury flop for the challenges and the bar that I'm setting with these 3 rules. So the first one is really simple. It's what we have already. Every new product or service must provide great experience and excellent value. It has to be accessible, affordable, valuable, and delightful. And I think since the iPhone, which to its credit set a new standard, we're getting good at that, which leads to the problem that we now have because we are good at it. We're getting all this more cyber crud out there that's making our work difficult. At the same time, every product, that means application, device, or service, has to work seamlessly with all the others in the ecosystem. Things have to play nice together. They need to be able to have relationships. That means they have to have an awareness. I have to be aware of you before, and then somehow meet you, then negotiate that, but figure out how to do that in a secure way and a seamless way. And I'll give you some examples where this already exists. We just don't see it because it works so well, we don't pay attention to it. And this is the one that's important. This is the Renaissance team of devices and technologies. That in working together seamlessly, each thing I add must reduce the overall complexity of what is already there, geometrically, not arithmetically, and it must increase the value of everything that's there already and what's going to come, and furthermore, it. That's a tall order. That's the bar. That's the high bar. That's the hard one to get over. But I'm just saying, if you can't do it, if you can figure that one out, we have a future. If we can't figure that one out, we don't have a future. And so it's imperative that you be aware of the problem, and you got about 5 years, in my estimation. So I'll give you an example, because they have to do an existence proof that some of this stuff is possible. So I've used this example for a long time, so I apologize, but it's one that all of us already know, we have experience with, and so there'll be some familiarity, but there might be a surprise. So you know that the interaction language of that phone, and it doesn't matter if it's an iPhone or an Android phone, I just don't care. It's eyes on and fingers on. That's how you operate it, correct? And that's a car. And that used to be my car. My son has it now, but it's it's a 2010 Ford Escape that has Microsoft Sync in it. I bought that car precisely because it had Microsoft Sync in it for the Bluetooth. Away you go. Now, here's the point. I get the car. I put the phone on the passenger seat, and I start driving along, and Jos gives me a call. So in the middle of the call, when we're talking, where's the phone? And of course, there's only a couple legitimate answers. And I know you're not going to answer because anybody who knows me knows that I'm going to jerk you around, and no matter what you say, I'm going to come back and make you look foolish. But that's getting used to it. Get over it. It's a game. And the point is this. The answer, where's the phone? You could say yes. I'd accept that. That's a pretty cool answer. Everywhere. But actually, my favorite thing would be, it's not about the phone. It's about the conversation. But I can say this as engineers, that if your car and your phone have an established kinship, then they merge together into something which cannot be separated. They aggregated, just like the two scalars in a position, into a new thing, which during that has much better speech, uses the microphone, the speaker, and by the way, of the handset, only about 5 to 10% of that's being used. The SIM chip, the Bluetooth chip, a battery, and a little bit of electronics. Everything else is in the car, and the interaction language is totally speech in and speech out. And I don't mean for the conversation, I mean for the interaction, with a few exceptions of buttons on the steering column. So you've got a 100% change in interaction language, a 90% change in the hardware on the phone when you're in the car, and you didn't have to do anything except get in the car. And the phone just rings, off we go. Now when I get out of the car, I turn it off, I pick up the handset in the middle of the conversation, and that's when I just start to laugh. I still do, because what happened? Not only when I'm driving down the highway is my phone call being passed from cell tower to cell tower seamlessly without me even being aware the cell towers are there, unless I'm going up in the Beaver Valley up north and there is no cell coverage, but presuming I've got cell coverage. But 90% of the interaction language changed. Sorry, 100% of the interaction language, 90% of the hardware managed to call, and because of those two huge inconsistencies, I have complete consistency of conversation. And it's totally seamless. And most of us don't even notice. If I asked you while you're driving the car doing that, what is interaction language for your iPhone? You're going to say the multi-touch and that, when you're doing exactly the opposite, right? That's good design. By the way, if you do it well, that means nobody's going to know about you. Because great design is like plumbing. You should only notice it when it's broken. There's stuff all over the floor. And so this brings us down to what's going on here. Technically, you need the seamless aggregation of disaggregation of technologies. And from the functionality in the usage case, there has to be this graceful augmentation and degradation of capabilities. And furthermore, the aggregation and augmentation probably sometimes are linked, and it's predictable this. But the other part that's important and took me way too long to figure out is that some things, as I aggregate, you get degradation. For example, driving your car, you degrade, you can no longer play Angry Birds. You no longer can do an Excel spreadsheet. But because of Ubiety, the moral order of place is maintained, and that's totally inappropriate. So I can just suppress all the stuff that violates the moral order, and the more I know about place and can take that into account, the better. The more I know what to suppress and what to augment, in context, dynamically. And the same thing's there. Now, this comes back to some work that George and Gordon, the people here did we did some stuff called sentient data. But in some sense, I'm saying these are sentient applications, sentient devices that actually can sense, not just sense, but then also negotiate, communicate, and do the right thing that fits the moral order of place. Those are all social science things. And this comes down to a couple of things here. How did I bounce up here? Okay. 2 cases of speech interfaces, though, because I want to make out that this isn't just about switching from one to the other by location. Or driving the car, if I'm not using speech, I should lose my driver's license. Why are you doing that? If I'm in a plane, if I am using speech to send a confidential message to my boss that has huge business implications, I should lose my job, right? And notice it has nothing to do with the AI and the speech. Do we have to have a plurality of interaction methods that can accommodate within the moral order of any place where that device will be used. And so consistency in and of itself is completely the wrong thing to do. Consistency with moral order of place is the only consistency that matters, assuming we can minimize any useless learning because of bad design. And so the speech here, so AI and speech are not going to solve this problem. But it can help the speech get better when it's appropriate. So this comes down to Kranzberg's first law. He's a historian of technology. Search him out. We don't have time to go through the whole thing. But basically, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And so as we're designing things, we have to start taking account of, because I'm using words like good and bad. Good and bad means I have an ethical or moral compass in which to calibrate my decisions. But it also says every time I even introduce a paperclip into a society or an organization, I am making an ethical decision. And I'm completely ill-equipped to do so unless I've actually taken explicit measures to bring those considerations into the team at the earliest period of consideration, which means I probably have to reconstitute, just like we used to have to add a designer, you definitely need somebody with social science and this type of skills on the team as well. And I mean that really seriously. And this comes down to this notion about why place in Ubiety is so important. There's an architect, Louis Kahn, who's one of my heroes. And if you ever have the chance to go down to UCSD and visit the design labs at La Jolla, one of the great things to go there is go to the Salk Institute. It's one of those beautiful, one of my favorite pieces of architecture. And, but I was at an exhibit of Louis Kahn's work in Munich several years ago, and there was this quote from him I noticed. It said, "Thoughts exchanged by one another are not the same in one room as in another." This is really important. That rooms are not the same, and as I move, the actions are not the same. Everything has to be interpreted in context. And Kranzberg, by the way, speaks to that if you go into his work. And then we come down to this notion about if it is about place, and it is about Ubiety, and it is about adaptability, then there's something really important here. And that is, we have to transform what we mean when we say mobility. Some of you might have been confused. Satya Nadella, when he became CEO of Microsoft, came up and he said, okay, here's the new line for Microsoft. Cloud first, mobile first. It's a great thing. But I immediately sent him a note and said, Satya, I understand what you're saying, and I think it's the right thing to say. But if you don't change what you're saying, this is what happens. People are asking, how can two things be first? That's confusing. Second of all, what do you mean mobile first? Why not my desktop? Why not my watch? No. Here's what you do. Just add on to it. Cloud first, mobile first, and when I say mobile, I mean the mobility of the human activity. Supported by technologies in the ecosystem that are appropriate, one of which may be this, but not necessarily, like in your car. So this is, you get a new definition of mobility, but then I come into this notion of transitions. That because that is the most important thing that's changed, is who's doing what, where, when, and how with whom, as we move through the task space in these compound tasks and these different multidimensional notions of place, I need to be able to move seamlessly with a minimum overhead. And that takes us to this notion of transitions. And the worst, not my favorite riddle, bad riddle I've ever made up, and that is, what do Canada and transitions have in common? Anybody who's taken graph theory will appreciate this especially. What Canada and transitions have in common, they're both dominated by the states. Okay? So all I'm saying is that when you're putting up these storyboards, so-called storyboards, showing the screenshots and this and that around your case studies and so on and so forth, if you do not have as much detail in the arrows as you do in the nodes, you've already lost the game. Because engineering will start to build it the way you designed it, which means it's going like that. You're going to come back in and say, hey, no, it's supposed to move like this. It's supposed to be beautifully smooth animated. You didn't tell us, too bad. It's too late. We're behind schedule. Bye. Yeah. Your fault. And guess what? It is. So let's go through this to get a sense of how these things escalate. I'm going to go from position, two scalars to a position, to a higher order task. Here the task is get the shopping from the checkout counter to the car. So here is a guy walking out of Staples with a shopping cart, and it's longer than his arm. So either you bash the door with the shopping cart, or the door opens. So it turns out up here, there's a sensor. It's sort of like Connect version 0.01. And the door just opens. And therefore he goes. And it's not his door. It doesn't know who he is. It's nothing. It's just a stupid 1-bit computer with sensor with the display is the door, the mouse is the sensor, and it's just dumb. He gets through the door. And the first one was done in 1931 in North America. This is the kind of thing how you get detailed, so you've done your research. Wilcox Pier Restaurant, West Haven, Connecticut, 1931, first automated door in North America. But if you really do your research, go to Heron of Alexander in the 1st century AD. He built one too. God, I want to figure out it was water operated, which is really weird too. So go figure. I'll leave that to you to go figure that one out. Here's a more modern Ford Escape than mine. I now have this model. And here's a woman trying to get the groceries now into the car. Now, Ford tried to get the problem I'm addressing here right, where you kick underneath the car like that to open the gate, to get the groceries in the back. Now, so it's a woman shopping typically because we live in a sexist society, and the women, even though they're working full-time as well as the men, they still have to do the shopping, feed the kids and stuff like that. And so they're probably not wearing flats. They might have heels. They might be living in Toronto. It might be icy. And if you do that, you're going to be flat in your ass. Actually, if you're a guy, you're going to be flat in your ass. But you're used to it because you play hockey. That's sexist too, because girls play hockey. But, okay? But the point I'm getting at here is that it's not a good design. That car is not a car. It is a $10,000 computer. It's a $30,000 car, 1/3 of the cost of a modern cars and information systems. The cable harness costs more than the motor. These are all true facts. And it's got a GPS in it. It knows that it's at a supermarket, or it's knowable. It has a rear-facing camera. It has sonar. It has keyless entry. My wife's 2010 RAV4 lights up as she walks by, and it knows it's her because of the key fob. It has everything in it, sensor networks, ambient intelligence, all these fancy-dancy things that are the keywords of the day. And by the way, they've had them for 10 or 20 years. But does the door open? No. And then you think about it. I have a $10,000 computer that's so stupid you have to do this at best, even though there's a motor that will open the trunk of your car or the thing. And here I have a door that's as dumb as a doornail, and it works. So which one is intelligent? That is way more intelligent than that. I don't care how much AR, and this is so unintelligent in terms of this task that it's embarrassing, given the technology that's sitting there latent, unused, to cooperate and serve this task. And I would argue that nearly everything we do has that type of ignorance because it's not my job. That's the possum on the freeway. They're just designing the thing for the car. They have no idea this car is used for going grocery shopping, and that the location and your approach from behind, that it's you with photo as well as radar and the key fob all together makes it safe to open that door. And I think if I spend $10,000 on something, it should at least, and it's mine, and there's a deep kinship, it's not a rental car, that it should have that. And I think in our environment, that's the class of problems. Now, there's an existence proof. There's a clear thing that is just simple matter of programming. Of course, they're never simple. The hard thing is knowing how to set problem setting. The problem solving is simple. And so I want to just say that that door is smarter. And Piaget, I just want to say, because I'm talking about this ecosystem in the society, is the social ecosystem of devices and people, is that his definition of intelligence is very different than that most people in deep learning use. And it's the ability of an organism to adapt to a changing environment through the complementary processes of assimilation and accommodation. The key thing is you got two options, assimilation and accommodation, but what your job is to adapt, to minimize the transaction costs and make things so smooth as possible so that the minimum amount of cognitive and motor sensory and social resources are used in making the transitions so you can maintain flow of your intended primary task. That's our job. And I argue that if we let the social relationships amongst things and the notion of compound tasks drive things, we can do this much better. And so there's just an exercise of imagination to leave you with. What if things just worked? Okay, that's already a challenge, I have to say. What if they work together? That's even more of a challenge. What if they work together seamlessly? And what if they did so with a reduction in overall complexity and an increase in overall value? And I want to just say to you, is there anything that you could possibly do in terms of the next big thing and changing the entire industry than achieve those what ifs? And I don't think there's anything in that list which is not possible, which is not achievable over the next 5 to 7 years. And I'm also saying there's a great big stick about to hit us if we don't do it in that time frame. And so there was a time when some of us of a certain age started in this field. We took for granted that our text editor would crash every 5 minutes. We did not, and we'd have to save every 30 seconds. And we thought we'd died and gone to heaven to have the privilege of having stuff that crashed all the time. We're through that now. So things are starting to work. But we've got to push it up a level in terms of things working together. Our cars work together with our phones, but not with ourselves when we come with the groceries. And the GPS doesn't work with the car and these other things. We can fix that. But when we start trying to go off and do the next big thing and what we're going to do for our theses or what we're going to do in our next projects, think of changing the relationships as opposed to making a new device. Leverage people's existing investment so they get more power from it, and you will have a far better and more sustainable business, and you'll gain expertise. And so we can, in fact, do virtually anything we can imagine today, including what I'm describing. So the question is now not can it work or can it sell or stuff like that, but rather, now that we can do anything, what should we do? And that comes back to Kranzberg, where everything we do is an ethical decision. And your priorities and your values are reflected in what you choose to do, as a company and as an individual. And that's the provocation that I would leave you with, at which point, if we have time, I hope for some questions. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to bring mics so people can actually hear the questions. And if you throw up your hands, there's some here and there.
What's the stick you referred to?
The which?
What's the stick you just referred to?
The stick? Oh, the stick. Oh, that's the implosion or explosion of our industry. The stick is what's we risk happening to the whole digital sector if we do not address this issue of complexity.
So your last point, right, is like, nerds and geeks just do technology, but you're saying there's a moral aspect to it that we should keep in mind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my Twitter feed is there, it's WAS Buxton. If you go there, you'll find a link to Kranzberg's essay on Kranzberg's laws. And he will talk to that far more eloquently than me. But I would say that any technological decision you make in introducing technologies into a society is, in fact, an ethical decision. If you want an example, you could say Facebook, that if you do not anticipate Kranzberg's first law, things can be good and bad, and you simply assume that targeted advertising is a safe revenue model, then don't complain about Donald Trump. The fact is that the tech sector has impulse. And so you can get away from technological determinism and say, well, there's steps here where you don't have to go through the door. But that you have to take into account what are the powers of persuasion and where they weighted in terms of pushing you through the door, sucking you through the door unawares. And are those biases balanced? So yeah, it's at a meta level. But they can be yes, they better. I think the same thing is that if your parents didn't drive and you start driving and you all of a sudden start with a motorcycle, you risk killing yourself. But if you grew up with a parent who had a car and drove well and had a motorcycle, you would actually have assimilated that. And so there's a learning curve. But I think that we've come comfortable with assuming that we want everything to be free. and not realizing nothing is free. There's a cost for everything. You just don't know the currency. And even if you did know the currency, you don't know the exchange rate for the crossing from one currency to another. And therefore, I would be highly cautious. Your entire private information was sold in perpetuity for $220 at the time Facebook went public. That's what your stuff is worth.
Hi.
Yes?
Hi, Bill.
Hey, how you doing?
So the way things develop in this world is we're all a bunch of ants working on a project. We don't communicate very well, not as well as ants, perhaps. Or maybe the projects we're getting at are more complicated for the communication. Anyway, that we have a system now which develops technology, which is capitalism, which incentivizes stickiness and all kinds of things which are against the project you propose. Well, just for example, the most successful cell phone is the Apple iPhone, and it does everything to keep you within its circle. How do we get cooperation without some kind of monopoly system, let's call it?
Yeah, so you're asking somebody from Microsoft about monopolies. I just like the irony of that. So first of all, I think that there is, the first thing I'd say is, it is incorrect that the iPhone has one mobile. There are far more Android phones out there than there are iPhones. If somebody wants to correct me, I believe that to be a true statement, but significantly true, not just a little bit true. But be that what it may, I would say that I'm not here to advertise the company. I want to speak in a general way, but I will say that, yes, Apple has a walled garden approach to their ecosystem, and that's how they have chosen to do it. And all I can say without making a value judgment statement is say that explicitly in our mission and everything else being hammered down, that is exactly the opposite of Microsoft's approach. And so there are larger companies that are trying to provide an alternative, and because and that's manifest in the fact that we released sort of Office on Android and the iPhone before some of the latest features, before we put them on the Windows Phone, which really pissed off a lot of people on the Microsoft phone group. But the reason was to make that statement that our values are for the customer, and we should not be dictating the hardware that they use, or even the platform. But whatever platforms are out there that have traction they're using, we have to be able to accommodate them. And that's, so there is a role for industry to play in that and provide an option. But the second thing is, I think that in many cases, I said this at a talk at SIGCHI, when Lifetime Achievement Award thing, and I just sort of said one of the things we can do as researchers is publish 1 or 2 less scientific papers a year and start publishing things in the popular press in layperson's terms, because these things are understandable, and try to help change the mindset to actually help people be more literate. Like, this stuff is new. We shouldn't be surprised that there's confusion, because there's a lot of change happening. If we can take some ownership of trying to help bring some literacy. Listen, I'll give you an example. Go to the Globe and Mail, open up any issue, and look how books are reviewed. You cannot talk about any book, any concert, any art show, any architectural review, any theater production, or any film without taking into account the historical context and the social, cultural, political implications. None of the arts live in a vacuum. Now, if you reviewed a Margaret Atwood novel, the way that technology is usually discussed in the popular press, it would be sort of like this. It has a fantastic cover. It so protects the pages from getting damaged. And by the way, its integration with the binding and is excellent, so the pages don't fall out individually or as collectively from the cover. It's got a great luminance contrast between the color of the paper and the color of ink, therefore facilitating the isolation of the characters. And by the way, it's got this incredible search mechanism on it that's efficient. The pages are numbered. It's got a table of contents. It's got an index. And by the way, unlike Roman times in the early days of the Roman characters that we use today, it has lowercase as well as uppercase. And by the way, there's even spaces between words, and there's punctuation. Because by the way, in Roman times, you only had majuscule letters, and they were block capitals, and there were no spaces, and there was no punctuation. Somebody had to read and scan that. And by the way, there's a story. And until we realize that technologies are cultural artifacts which are having more impact on our society than all of the arts put together, and start to treat it that way and discuss it that way in terms of discourse, and those of us in the field start to do that ourselves and hopefully help, then we're in trouble. And I think that that's one thing we can do as individuals and collectively as groups. But it also says within our hiring practice, just as a friend of mine, Wayne Cherry, who was the executive director of design for General Motors worldwide when General Motors was larger than Microsoft, he just said, because I was talking about how do we get design, how did you do it in GM versus Microsoft? He said, Bill, you can tell how seriously a company takes design by looking at the org chart. If there's a CTO and not a CXO, then they probably aren't yet serious enough. Microsoft still has a ways to go in that regard, I have to say. But I'd say the same thing around the social side of things. But I'd recommend if you want to see what we're doing, and again, I'm not trying to advertise, I'm just saying this is somebody who I really respect. There's a woman named Kate Crawford out of our New York lab who just this week, if you do AI now, set up jointly with another partner organized at NYU, a new institute on AI looking at the social ethical implications so that we basically have helped to establish at the academic level and outside of the company, even though she didn't have to give up her job, how to address these things. So the initiatives are there, the imperatives there, and I'm scared if we don't do it properly, but it's got to be wider. But that's the best I could say. Yes, back there, microphone, the red sweater. Oh, sorry, we get here, Bob. Yes, we'll come to you in a second.
Thanks, Bill, for your wonderful talk. I subscribe totally to your criteria that every new medium should enhance existing media in the environment. By that criterion, the smartphone is a complete failure because it has destroyed sociability. People don't talk to each other face-to-face anymore. They're too busy looking at their smartphone. Please comment.
So I made a comment recently, just probably on my Twitter feed, because something like that came up recently. I just wanted to. Stu Card said to me once that we were talking about mice and how many buttons should a mouse have. This is. I'm going to use this example because it relates to what I said earlier about it. These things, if you get the right level of abstraction, they apply to devices at the lowest level, to social things like that. He said the argument about mouse buttons is sort of crazy because when people say you only have one mouse button, the whole reason to make it simpler to use. No. You never make it simpler. There's a conservation of complexity law unless you do something really special. And all you've done is transfer the complexity to someplace else. Namely, with only one mouse button, the things you could get direct action to off the other two buttons, now you have to go through a higher level interface that's for the rest of your life, because you don't have direct access. And so now on your Apple products, you actually have multiple mouse buttons. You just have to use 2 fingers or another hotkeys at the same time because you kept up this religion of one button, except no, now you can use a 3-button mouse in a Macintosh and you realize it works perfectly. So it was all bogus. They didn't reduce complexity. They just hid it for a while and moved it someplace so you stumbled upon it later, but you had to pay a price for a long time. So that's the one part about this. And it's the same thing that's happened here. In terms of socialization on the phone, I would argue that it didn't kill socialization. It killed face-to-face socialization to a large extent, but it didn't kill it. It actually augmented it for remote socialization, so that people remote from you, so-called friends, because this perversion of the word friend, the reason I don't subscribe to Facebook and never have is A, I refuse to live in a gated community, and 2, because I have a better definition of friend, and I refuse to be put in a social situation where I have to unfriend or be chasing my friends, because I don't want to know if people don't want to be my friend. All this sort of stuff. I just want to ignore that whole thing. I refuse to do it. I just refuse to buy into it. So, but assuming you have all these friends, you've got this huge social thing. Not as superficial or as deep as it might be, but you haven't gotten rid of the socialization. You've just moved it, like complexity with mouse buttons. And now the question is, can you get the best of both worlds? And that's an interesting question. If there is a best world of that other one. And of course there is, because we communicate, that allows us to have an international community within our space, and I couldn't live without email. I live in Toronto, my office is in Seattle, and I have people all over the world that I work with. So I don't want to get rid of that, but I sure miss. I'd say, when I was at Georgia Tech last time, we were there. I went out to dinner with a bunch of graduate students, and at the end of dinner, we went to that taqueria, which is a combination of tacos and Korean food. And at the end of the meal, I just turned to the graduate students and I said, thank you. And I said, for what? And I said, this is the first meal I've had in 6 months where nobody pulled out a smartphone. And I think that was, there's nothing you could have done that would have pleased me more. And so when that happens, I mention it. And you can gradually change behaviors. Sorry, I'm running back here.
Anyway, it's great to see you face to face.
Yes, likewise. And by the way, this whole thing about media, this is Mr. McLuhan, scholar here, who actually was pushing me on a whole bunch of the stuff. So you know where this stuff came from. Yeah.
Hi. I just found it very interesting that you used the analogy of a city and sort of the suburban, connection problem. And as someone who's interested in sort of urban design, urban planning, that sort of thing, I find it interesting that in that field, people tend to use technology as an analogy for, how their problems are represented and how there are all these parallelisms in the issues that we face in these two different fields. So I sort of get the sense that there's a very dichotomous reality in that we sort of look to that side of things and they sort of look to our side of things. And then there's no real synthesis, as far as I can tell, of ideas in terms of the solutions to problems that we have. So is that something you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, actually, so that's a wonderful example that leads to something that's actually operational from all of us. So that you've got one set of models and conceptual frameworks that digital technology brings, that architecture as availing themselves and urban design. And likewise, we're looking at yours as well as sociology, right? So I have this rule that people who know me have heard it ad nauseum. Everything is best for something and worst for something else. And the intelligent designer is the one who knows when to use what, with whom, and why. And the thing that comes as well, there's a Canadian, Ken Iverson, who won the Turing Award. He developed something called APL, but he recently his Turing Award lecture was called Notation as a Tool of Thought. Anybody who's taken any math understands that, ask Duncan if you want, or Jos, that you will use different representations for different types of problems. But sometimes you have a problem where to solve this problem for which there is no single notation, you will use different representations in parallel and then look at the results, and then you start to see relationships from there. And then you can pull things out and say, oh, I can actually have this parallel thing, and actually I can build algorithms that optimize there. So I would say that it's not a this or that representation or that. That if you understand the various models you can bring, that helps you bring a diverse set of perspectives to the problem, which collectively might gain some insights that let you actually address it in a reasonable way. And remember, the difference between an algorithm and a program or a procedure is that one gives you an approximation and the other one gives you an answer. Right? And all good is fine. In fact, Voltaire said the perfect is the enemy of the good. Just go for good and get in the ballpark, and then you'll learn from that experience.
Thank you very much.
One more question.
Yeah, in the red.
Yeah. That'll be our last question.
Hello, I'm thrilled to be here, by the way. I love your talk. You spoke about the increasing complexity over the next 5 to 7 years and the stick looming over us. And somebody else asked about, or you talked a lot about social and moral implications. Don't you think that undergraduate curriculum for scientists and engineers need a lot more focus on these issues? And you also spoke about scientists publishing a little less in scientific venues and more in magazines and layperson's terms. So I wanted to add to that and say that we need a lot more scientists and engineers involved in legislation and policy making, because technology is advancing at this extreme pace and the legislation and policy for making it a tool for good is not keeping up.
I think that's absolutely true, especially in a climate where science is just an opinion, and my opinion is as good as yours kind of thing, where it's acceptable to have somebody who doesn't believe in climate change as the head of the EPA, for example. But the good news is that, for example, if you look at our new Governor General, Julie Piaget, she's spectacular. She's super literate in the arts and in the technology. She's a past colleague. We worked with her, a guy from Mission Hayward and me in preparation for her first mission because she was on the Canadarm. And she's like, having that voice in Ottawa is a really good start. And the fact she's a woman is like a double bonus because but I have a couple quick thoughts to finish up on this. And that on the one hand, some of my colleagues at Microsoft are pushing really hard, and correctly so, to help improve STEM education. And especially for women, and especially in the ages of about 11 to 13 or 14, which is where this happens. But not just for women, but for everybody. And so there's a lot of initiatives there. So yes, everybody should learn to be pushing STEM and stuff like that. But I would argue that people who are naturally inclined towards STEM need to have just as much about the arts and cultural side of things. And so I'm an advocate, absolutely, of a balanced liberal arts type of education. At the literacy level, well, you can still specialize in your field, but you have, by that liberal arts literacy, you have a common ground with which you can talk to people in the other disciplines and avoid the two cultures problem that has been around in the past. I would say that for me, doing a bachelor's of music was the best thing I ever did to prepare myself for what I do today. And it's not a surprise that Kate Crawford, who's the person who started this thing at NYU that I spoke about from Microsoft Research in New York, still a recording musician. She's from Australia, so she has this other cross life too. So it's just, these problems cut across the educational system all around. They're not going to change overnight. When I went to Microsoft and not to Apple, which was an option, the question was, why would you do that? And I said, because there's no merit in being an angel in heaven. You don't need me. I'd rather go to hell, in some sense. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that Microsoft really needed some skills. And there was at that point in my life, it seemed like if you could actually have impact there, you could really make a difference. And that's, as a child of the 60s, that's kind of what you always wanted to do, right? But I just mentioned that and sort of saying, when I started, I thought what sort of has happened would have happened within 3 or 4 years. It's taken like 12. And so don't expect things to move quickly. It's this long nose of innovation and evolution. It takes a long time, but you got to keep at it, and you get better at it. But as one of my climbing partners says, just going back to the mountain picture back there, is Barry Blanchard, he said to me, we were climbing something, he's a really good climber, and he's way up above me, and I'm up on this wall, and I'm sort of, Jesus, Barry, this is really hard. And he looked down at me and said, Bill, what you don't understand is, without foreshortening, nobody would climb anything. And everything has to look easier before you start, or you would never do anything. So, and then you get halfway up the wall of whether it's trying to change a culture of Microsoft or actually climb a wall, you realize, oh my God, I'm way over my head, and actually you do it. And that's the best part. And what we're in a position right now in terms of the problems I'm speaking about is I'm giving you a set of crampons, some ice tools to go up a waterfall, and you've got the skill. It looks manageable right now. You're going to encounter all kinds of things. But as you overcome them throughout your career, it's going to make that career the most satisfying thing you could ever imagine, and it's definitely worth doing. Trust me, I'm 68. Ask Becker, he'll tell you he's even older than that. And if you look at, he's got more energy than most undergraduates. And that's why, because of what comes out of the payback you get if you actually make the effort. So thank you again very, very much.